In this video, we're going to look at painting our texture map and blending textures into our texture map in Photoshop. By now, you should have a model completed and a UV map laid out similar to this one. You may have several maps, one for each item, or you may have texture atlased your items like I have here into one large 4K map. Now, it doesn't actually matter what size your UVs were saved out at. If you go to Image and Image Size, you can change the size of those UVs. So mine are 4096 by 4096, which I want because there's a lot going on in this texture map, so I need as many pixels as possible. But I can change that up or down. I could go to 8K. Easy way to do that would be go to percent and just put it in 200% if I wanted to go to 8K. And that will get me right up to a higher resolution. Otherwise, I could go to 50% and I'd be down to 2K 2048 by 2048. Okay, so image size is a good way of changing the size of your texture map. So let's look at setting up some layers here. First of all, rename your UV map to UV map so you know what it is, and then lock it down with this little lock icon above your layers tab here, or inside your layers tab. Next, I'm going to import a base reference, which I already have here, and I'm going to resize that and then lock that down as well so that it doesn't move. That's not going to be in the final texture. It's just there for reference of colors. I also had a color palette in my concept art here, so what I have done is open my concept art sheet, and you'll see I have the color palette here. I can drag that actually straight out of my layers and into my other document by hovering over it and then depositing that there. So I'm going to use this as a color reference. So now that I've got all those layers in and locked, I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to pop that underneath the rest of my layers, double click it and call this background. And this layer I'm going to color in a middle grey kind of color. Just so I can see whites, I can see blacks, I can see most colors that will stand out well against it. This will also help your UVs to pop because it's very hard to see them against the transparent background. That is the transparency grid. So we have a lot of objects here. Let's look at a couple of ways that we can texture up these objects in a way that's orderly so that we're not going to be drawn over the line of other objects while we're working on certain ones. I'm going to create a new layer for each object that I'm going to paint. So here I'm going to do the bottom of the base. So I'll just call this layer base bottom. Okay, and then I'll make another layer for base top. With my base bottom layer selected, I'm going to get a hard round brush at 100% opacity, and I'm going to just fill in the shape that is the base bottom there, so it's overlapping all of the edges of that part of the UV map. Then I'll select the base top. I'm going to change the color slightly. And I'm going to do the same thing for the top. Just get a big brush and paint in, making sure that I don't overlap any other part of the UVs as I do. So you want to get all of the UVs in there and leave a bit of padding around the edges as well. So you don't need to be particularly neat. And these are going to serve as a base for the masks that we're going to create to paint over. And I'll just go ahead and do that for each one of these. It may actually be easier, rather than using a paintbrush, to use the polygonal lasso tool or the standard lasso tool to make these selections. Now what we've just created is called an ID map, or a color ID map, and this is something that can be used both here in Photoshop to make masks, and it's very important in using Substance Painter to texture our models. I've realized that my UV map doesn't stand out very well in red above the rest of my map, so I'm going to unlock that. I'm going to press Ctrl and U to go into my hue saturation tool, and I'm going to pop the lightness up full just to make it white, and that will stand out a lot better for me. And lock that layer again. So at this stage you want to make sure that the colors are covering just what they're meant to. It doesn't matter if you go outside the lines as long as you're not going into other UV shells. So you can see here I have my claw orb in one shell, my claw in another shell, the rocks there in another ID shell, the well there covered by another ID color, the pillar, the base top and the base bottom. So I've laid out my map in a way that I understand where everything is. If you forget, you can always pop back into Maya and you can check by going into your UV map and going to UV shell and just clicking on it, and you'll see exactly where it is that each thing applies to. So at this stage, if you're using Substance Painter to texture, you can hide your UV map. You never show your UV map whenever you're saving out textures. You always hide it. It's just there to show you the position of the edges. And it's never saved out with that, otherwise you'll see all these little lines across your model. You also hide the color palette and any references. Then go to File, Export, and Quick Export as PNG and save that out as an ID map. I'll be covering using your ID map in Substance Painter in a separate video. I'd encourage you, even if you are using Photoshop to texture at this time, to save out that diorama ID map now, and you can always use that in the future to come back and use Substance Painter to retexture your model if you want to use it as practice sometime. So it's always good to save out things as we go. Now, when texturing in Photoshop, if we're going to use Photoshop to paint either with a tablet or with our mouse, we want to create a mask out of each one of these layers. So I'm going to select my first layer, the base bottom here, and what I'm going to do is hold Control and click on the little thumbnail image of my layer, and you see that that makes a selection of the ID that we've just painted. And then I'm going to click this little button in the bottom of our layers tab. It looks like a hole punched in a page, like a white page with a black hole punched in it, and I'm going to press that to add a layer mask based on that selection that was made, and you'll see that the layer mask here is in black and white. So while I have that selected, I will be editing the mask and not the image itself. So you can see if I start clicking, it starts deleting parts of the mask out. That's not what I want to do right now. If I want to paint in here, I want to select my layer, and you see I can paint within my layer, and it's all masked off so that it won't interrupt any of the other UVs here or overlap into other UV spaces. So I'm just going to do that for all of my layers. Again, that is Control and hold Control and left click on the thumbnail image, and it will select around anything that you put paint on using your brush or your polygonal lasso tool, and then going to use the mask button, add layer mask, to add a mask to that layer, so that when I'm painting on this layer, all that I paint is within the edges. So it's kind of like it's very much like using the lock transparency button. The advantage being that we can go in and edit this mask, which we can't do in the transparency function, by going in and clicking, or you can use X to change your color here from black to white, and you can paint that back in again. So it's non-destructive painting. Anything that you do in the mask, if you're expanding it or making it go away, is non-destructive, as in it can be edited later on. So I'm going to use that Control and click the thumbnail and add mask for each of my layers. So now that I'm not going to accidentally paint on the wrong layers, I'm going to select the layer that I'm using, make sure to select the layer itself and not the mask on the layer, and I can just begin painting up each of these layers like my concept art. And I'm going to be using the Alt tool, that's the quick select for color picker, or my I, that is my color picker tool here, to select colors from my concept art and from my color palette here, and I'm going to use my brush tools to fill this in as best I can. That's the base colors done in this texture map. There are a few other things that I need to do, and that is to add in some detail work that won't work using a big brush like I've just been doing. So what I'll do is I'll start with the rocks here. If we take a look in Maya, these rocks, if I right click and go to UV, that'll select the UV vertices, and you see if I drag along the bottom here, that is indeed the bottom of this rock. So I want the gradient of dark blue coming up from the bottom here to kind of imitate shading, and if I highlight here, I can see that that is the bottom of the other side of the rock on the underside, which you can't see too clearly under there. I would need to zoom in. There you can see I'm selecting the undersides of the rock. And then similarly with the strip here, which is the strip along the side of the rock, I need to find out whereabouts the top is. So I can just click that in the model, and you see it highlights here. So that's the top, so this is where the highlights are going to go. And then you can see if I highlight this side here, that is the underside. You'll see the underside of these rocks. So I know where the bottom is here. It joins onto here, and it joins onto here on the underside. So all of those need to be darker. So let's pop into my Photoshop document here. So that's going to be tricky on this, because if I use a dark blue here, and I have my big soft round brush, you see it's painting dark over this top part of the rock, which I don't want to be dark. I want that to be lighter. So this is where your polygonal lasso tool can come in. You could technically create more masks, but I can simply use L, my polygonal lasso tool here, and I'm going to create a lasso around, this is the bottom face of the rock first of all. And on that same layer, I'm just going to add some shading, simply into the bottom there. Great. Control D to deselect, L to get my lasso tool again. I'm going to select around this top part of the rock. And then I'm going to use my soft round brush again to brush in that shading to the bottom of this rock. Next, I'm going to take a look at this strip here. So I identified the bottom as being here. So I'm just going to, I don't even need to do any selections here. I'm just going to simply paint that in on the bottom there. Okay, so we're guesstimating kind of these. I know that this side joins onto here, so I'm kind of guessing at the gradients. And hopefully it'll look okay and won't be too noticeable. you always run the risk of your UV seams here not matching up with the gradients that you've painted around the sides. That's why we generally use Substance Painter for this kind of work, because it paints all the seams at once, but I'll show you that again in another video. So I'm going to use that same trick here where I get my lasso tool and select around. This is it's like a little cone that leads down to the lava from the rocks, and I am going to, it's in a well. And I'm going to use these orange tones around the, let's see, the center of the well, which is going to be here, so just to show the kind of, no, that's going to be going down into lava, so that's the top. It should be something like that. And then finally the lava itself is going to be this dome here. What I'm actually going to do for that is return to my concept art. I'm going to grab the lava that I created in there, and I'm going to pull that directly into my texture here. Just Control and T to free transform. I'm going to hold Alt so it scales up from the center. Reposition that. It's a wee bit fuzzy looking, but it's not too bad. See how it looks once it's applied, and boom. So that's most of our base colors done there. Let's take a look at applying this to our model and checking that it looks okay for a start. There's going to be errors and it's going to be a bit of back and forth. So first of all, hide all your references. Then make sure you always hide the UV map. You don't want your UV map shown in your texture map. And then you go to File, Export, Quick Export as PNG will be us fine. And I'm just going to name that and save it. I'm using the naming convention here, diorama_albedo, because this is just an albedo color map that we're creating for this project. Now if you set up your Maya project like we did at the start of this video, what you should be able to do actually is just cut that and paste it into the position Fantasy Diorama project. See, you'll have images here. Okay, so I'm just going to paste it into my images folder in that project folder, and it means that if I copy that Maya project, all the textures and images will come with me. Back into Maya now, close my UV editor. So what I want to do is apply this texture. So with my objects selected, and again all these objects should be combined if they're sharing material, right click and scroll down to assign new material and then let go. And all I want is a matte material with no shininess on it. I'm going to select a Lambert. Then you'll see in your attribute editor here, if you scroll across to the right as far as you can go, oh, there's a lot of history there. First I'm going to delete the history on this, edit, delete all by type history to get all that to go away, and you see my Lambert 2 is just right there. I'm going to rename this to diorama_albedo, or that should be maybe diorama_material actually, because it's a material. And then always hit enter on this to rename it. If you don't hit enter and you click away, Maya will often crash, especially Maya 2018, which I'm using an older version of Maya. So the next thing is it's our color tab that we want to use here. So I'm going to select the wee checkerboard beside color. I'm going to select file and then this little folder icon, and I'll go in and find in my project here the texture, diorama albedo, open. Okay, and that's the map applied. Now it doesn't look like it's applied, but that's because we don't have our texture shaded display on. So number 4, again, wireframe on your keypad. Number 5 is shaded display. Number 6 will show your textures. At this point you can go in and see all of the flaws and errors that have been created in your texture map. So the first blindingly obvious one that I see is here, where this goes from brown to blue, and there's also some bleed here of a bright kind of like flare from the lava. If I look around my object here, I can see another flare from the lava here bleeding into this texture, which is not good. There's a couple of other little minor things, like, you know, you can easily see the edge on this hand here, but that's not going to bother me. That's really, really close up. The stones generally look okay. And you can see the well, the gradient is the wrong way around. I want the deep blue to be down at the bottom, and I want this kind of browny red color to be near the top, nearest to the hot lava. So I've got a bit of color sorting out to go back into Photoshop. I've obviously assumed that if I go back into my UV checker, you'll see the texture overlaid here. So I have assumed here that this, yes, if I go into edge mode, it's easier to see. It's like this edge here, you see it's along the bottom, and I thought that was the top edge, so I've ordered these wrong in the UV map. And I'm not going to change the UV map at this point. I'm going to stick with what I got and just know that this is actually the bottom of the well here. and not the top of the well. And for this edge, that's the inside edge there. I thought that the inside edge up here. So there's all sorts of things that you're going to see. If I jump back into my Photoshop, you'll see where this area is, that bleed, and also this bleed here. It comes from this layer, this lava layer, having a fill effect on it. So a layer effect. If I untick that effect, it'll disappear there, and that'll hopefully sort that out. So what I need to do is go back in, do some corrective painting, and then save that back out after hiding my UV map always. Another wee thing I'm noticing is the grass edge looks very artificial because it stops so quickly. So what I'm going to do is add in like a jagged kind of edge here to make it look like the grass is ending by using my polygonal lasso tool to select a kind of jagged edge and then paint that in. So I've just about finished that round of revisions. One little advanced tip with using masks, and this is another way to mask, is you can see here that I have used a separate layer to add in the edge of the grass here. And the way I did that was I just went into this Kyle Ultimate Pencil Hard, which comes, I think, with the standard brushes in Photoshop. And then it's a tiny, tiny wee brush. If you increase the size by using the closing square brackets, you see you get this, and you can use that brush to line your edges to make it look like grass, which I thought was quite neat. So what I'm going to do is I need to clip this grass edge into the base. So to do that, I'm going to drag this down to the base top there. And to clip an image inside another one, you hold Alt on your keyboard, and you'll see a little down arrow with a square up here. And then whenever I click, you see it will pop that layer in underneath the edges of this one. So again, all I have to do is have this layer above the one I want to clip it down into, hold Alt and then click, and it will clip that layer in for me, which means it's not going to spill out into the rest of them. So I'm going to save that over the top of my last the texture map, and it should automatically update in Maya. Now I'm in Maya, I've saved out my new texture, and you can see none of those changes have been applied to this yet, which is strange because I replaced the file. What you'll need to do is click your model, go into your material, which will be a Lambert or whatever you've named it to, and then prompt Maya to replace this texture with the new one. You're going to have to click on your color attribute here and hit reload underneath the image name, and that will reload in the texture that we have replaced it with, and we can take a look and see if that is a more suitable fit for this model. So this is looking fine. I kind of like the way the bricks have turned out. I kind of like the way the grass that's painted on has turned out. Not so much the grass and edges, but there'll be some bits that you don't like. One thing that is very noticeable though is this doesn't have any discernible texture on it, just colour. Same with the rock here, with the claw, and with this base. So what I want to do is add a wee bit, at least something that implies texture on top of those. So I'm going to return to Photoshop the way we did with our concept art and overlay textures on top of this. So I went into textures.com, I searched for rock, and you'll see a whole range of great images that you can use. I found some here, soil with rocks in it for the base layer. I found this rock for the tombstone type rocks, and this one I'm going to use as a general kind of layer to give my wall a bit of texture. I don't want the bricks and stuff because I've already modelled bricks in my particular one, but this will give it a bit of grit. So to use these textures, all we really need here is the albedo layer. You may also want the ambient occlusion layer, but let's just stick with the albedo for now. So you'll need to log in. You see it will prompt you to log in, and then you can download the highest version that is available to you, the biggest size, which is 1024 by 1024 for me. So I'm going to grab the rocky soil here first of all, drag it into Photoshop. I'm going to position it above my bottom base here, and Control T to free transform. I'm going to transform that up so that it covers the entire base here. I'm going to change the opacity just so I can see, yeah, that's looking pretty good. Okay, and once that's done, hit enter to apply, or click the little tick up here. And I'm just going to make sure that's sitting within my UV radius. Yes, it is. And the next thing to do is I want to get some of that good colour that I've already painted there. I don't want to completely replace it with this texture. So to do that, what I need to do is change the blending mode from normal to something like there's multiply, there's darken, there's all sorts of different things. Common ones would be multiply or overlay, and there's also screen for things that you want to make lighter. Okay, so for instance, I could use overlay and then I could decrease the opacity of that. Or I could keep the opacity up and I could put a mask on that and I could paint out parts of the mask. Okay, so you can edit that to fit in with your texture, and I'm going to do that now. Another thing, remember, that I can do with this texture is clip it to the inside of this layer by selecting the layer, holding Alt, and then clicking in the space between the two layers, and it will clip it into that layer. I can even use my Move Tool V to move that layer around, and it will stay clipped within those boundaries, which is super, super handy whenever you're doing this overlay texture. So this is the finished version with the textures applied using overlay, multiply, things like that. And you can see the difference is quite remarkable, and not necessarily in a good way. So whenever I pop into Maya here, you'll see the difference applied. And there's some cool things going on here with the additional textures, especially to let you know that this is stonework, and you know that this is made of some sort of concrete or something like that. So there's some good things going on here. But if I look at the original brief, it was for something that looks hand painted, and really I'm not so sure that this looks like an incredibly hand painted piece of work. So what I might do is revert back to the colored piece and start painting my own details on it. But it's up to you how you want to texture your work. So you can go for a more realistic look like this, or I've saved in a different material folder. See, I can select my object, right click, assign existing material, and I can select my original material there and see the original. And I'm liking the colors in this. So if maybe I added in some rocks and things here, just using the polygonal lasso tool and my soft brush to kind of hint at some details, that might be a better look than this really realistic looking textured look. That's going to be up to you, what works best for your model and what meets the brief that you have in front of you. So that's a few tips and techniques for texturing hand painted work in Photoshop.